It was an ordinary winter evening when I received the invitation that would change everything. Betty, my daughter-in-law, had invited me to her family's lavish Christmas gathering. I had never expected Betty to reach out like this. In the 2 years she had been married to my son John, she had shown little interest in bonding with me. Still, I thought maybe this was an opportunity for a fresh start. Betty had always been critical of my modest lifestyle, often belittling my clothes, my choices, even my attempts to be part of their lives. But for John's sake, I wanted to give this gathering a chance. Maybe, just maybe, we could finally get along. Little did I know, this night would be anything but a step toward peace. With some hesitation, I picked out the dress my mother had passed down to me, an elegant piece with sentimental value. It was the only thing I had that could meet Betty's high expectations. But that dress, a symbol of my past, would soon become a battleground for pride, hurt, and betrayal. As I stood before Betty's enormous family mansion, my heart pounded in my chest. The house was like something out of a movie, massive, gleaming, and filled with laughter that echoed out into the cold night air. For a moment, I hesitated. I had always felt out of place around Betty's family. They were wealthy, powerful, and used to a lifestyle I had never known. My son John had adapted to their world with ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. I smoothed down my dress, trying to push the doubts away. This was a gift from my mother, and it carried memories of her that I cherished. I told myself I had every right to be here, just like everyone else. With a deep breath, I stepped inside, greeted by the warm glow of chandeliers and the smell of expensive perfume. Betty was waiting for me, her eyes scanning my appearance with that same familiar look of disdain. "Merry Christmas," I said, offering her a smile. But Betty wasn't interested in pleasantries. She grabbed my arm and pulled me aside without so much as a greeting. "Didn't I tell you to wear something nice?" Betty's voice was sharp, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. I could feel the judgment radiating off her. "This is a Christmas party, not a charity event." I tried to remain calm, reminding myself why I was here. For John. But it was hard not to let her words sting. I had chosen this dress because it meant something to me. It wasn't just about appearances. "I thought it was appropriate," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Betty wasn't listening. She was already walking away, leaving me standing there, feeling small and out of place. I followed her into a private room, confused by her sudden rush. What had I done now to displease her? Once we were alone, Betty turned on me again, her tone even colder. "You can't show up in something that looks this cheap," she said, her fingers brushing the fabric of my dress as if it were something filthy. My heart sank. This dress wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was one of the last things I had from my mother. But Betty didn't care. In her world, everything had a price tag, and if it wasn't expensive, it wasn't worth anything. Then, in one swift motion, Betty picked up a glass of beer from a nearby table, her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Before I could react, she flung the liquid right at me. The beer splashed across my dress, the fabric instantly soaking up the yellow stain. I gasped, the shock of the cold beer against my skin almost paralyzing me. "What are you doing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. Betty shrugged, a smug smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Relax," she said with a mocking laugh. "It's just a cheap dress. It doesn't matter if it gets dirty, right?" My hands instinctively clenched at my sides. I wanted to yell, to tell her how much this dress meant to me, but I couldn't find the words. Betty wasn't finished. "If you need money for a new one, I can give you $5,000, she said, laughing as though she had just made the funniest joke in the world. The room spun around me. I felt humiliated, powerless, but beneath that, anger was building, simmering just under the surface. This wasn't just about the dress. This was about respect, about dignity, and Betty had just trampled all over both. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears as Betty continued to laugh. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. I could feel my hands trembling, but I didn't want her to see that. I had to stay calm, had to keep control. "You've done something terrible, Betty," I said quietly, but firmly. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my attempt to stand up for myself. "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave. "I told you I'll pay for it. It's not that big of a deal." But she had no idea what she had just done. This dress was the last gift from my mother before she passed away. It wasn't just fabric and stitching. It was a piece of her. Something that had survived the years and carried her memory. Betty, of course, didn't know that. And even if she did, I doubt it would have made a difference. In her world, sentimental value meant nothing. Everything could be replaced, as long as you had the money. But some things couldn't be bought, and this dress was one of them. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. This was far from over. Betty smirked, completely oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. She was so wrapped up in her own sense of superiority that she didn't notice the shift in the air. "This dress," I began, my voice steady now, "cost $50,000. The words left my mouth with a calm I hadn't expected. Betty blinked, her laughter faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone disbelieving. "This? 50,000? Don't be ridiculous." I stepped closer, meeting her gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. It was custom-made by one of the finest designers. Every stitch, every bead was handcrafted. Betty opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. "You like luxury, don't you? Well, this is what real luxury looks like. Not that you'd know." Betty's face paled slightly, the confidence draining from her expression. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it showed. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, just as Betty seemed to be regaining her composure, the door creaked open, and a man stepped into the room. Betty's grandfather. The moment he walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Betty's grandfather was a man of quiet authority, the kind of presence that demanded respect without him needing to say a word. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene before him. Me, standing there with beer dripping from my dress, and Betty, frozen in place with the glass still in her hand. "Betty," he said, his voice low but firm. Betty flinched, her confidence cracking further. "Gramps, I was just," she began, but he cut her off with a look. "What is going on here?" he asked, his gaze shifting from Betty to me, then back again. Betty hesitated, clearly unsure of how to explain the situation. I was just joking around," she stammered. "It was nothing serious." Her grandfather didn't look convinced. Slowly, he turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Karen, I apologize for whatever has happened here," he said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and gently dabbing at the beer stains on my dress. "I hope this doesn't ruin your evening." His kindness caught me off guard. I nodded, too stunned to speak. Betty stood awkwardly to the side, her bravado completely gone. She seemed like a child caught misbehaving, not the confident, domineering woman she had been just moments before. "Karen is an old friend of mine," her grandfather said, turning to address Betty. "We went to college together." Betty's eyes widened in surprise. "You know each other?" she asked, disbelief lacing her words. Her grandfather smiled faintly. "Yes, in fact, this dress," he gestured to the soaked fabric. "I gave it to Karen many years ago, after she won an award for one of her scripts." Betty's mouth fell open. "Wait, what? You're a writer?" she said, staring at me as if she was seeing me for the first time. I hadn't told Betty about my career. In fact, I had kept it quiet on purpose, not wanting to deal with her condescending attitude toward anyone who didn't have a real job in her eyes. But now, the truth was out. "I am," I said simply. "I've been writing for years. Your grandfather has been a fan of my work since the beginning." Betty looked completely thrown, as if the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. For the first time, she was speechless. The room grew quiet as Betty processed what she had just learned. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to make sense of it all. For so long, she had viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenience, someone beneath her. But now, faced with the truth, she seemed to realize just how wrong she had been. grandfather, meanwhile, was still focused on me. "This dress is very special," he said softly. "I'm sorry it's been treated with such disrespect." His words were kind, but there was an edge to them that wasn't lost on Betty. She fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly aware that she was in trouble. "Gramps, I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice small. "I didn't know it was that important." But her grandfather wasn't having any of it. "It doesn't matter whether you knew or not," he said sternly. "What matters is how you treat people, Betty. Money doesn't give you the right to behave like this." Betty's face flushed with shame, but she didn't argue. For the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of her actions. Her grandfather turned to me again. "Karen, would you like to stay for the rest of the party?" I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to walk out and never come back. But another part of me knew that this was a moment of change, not just for me, but for Betty too. She had been knocked down a peg, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes that she had gone too far. "I'll stay," I said finally, offering a small smile. Betty's grandfather seemed relieved. "Good," he said. "We'll find you something else to wear, and I'll make sure this dress is cleaned and returned to you." He gestured for one of the servants to help me, and within a few minutes, I was dressed in something new, though it didn't hold the same meaning as my mother's dress. When I returned to the ballroom, I saw John had arrived. He looked around, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. There was something in his gaze, concern, maybe suspicion. He made his way over to me, clearly sensing that something had happened. "Mom," he said quietly, "what's going on?" I glanced at Betty, who was standing across the room, looking more uncomfortable than I had ever seen her. Before I could answer, the sound of a microphone being tapped filled the room. Betty's grandfather had taken the stage, and the lively chatter in the room died down instantly. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying across the large space. "I have a special announcement to make." The room was filled with curious murmurs, everyone waiting to hear what the old man had to say. "As many of you know, our company has been looking to expand," he continued. "And after careful consideration, we've decided to open a new branch." A few polite claps followed his statement, but it was clear that people were waiting for the real news. "I am proud to announce," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Betty, "that my granddaughter Betty will be the one heading up this new branch." Betty's face drained of color. She looked around the room in shock, clearly not expecting this. "It will be a wonderful opportunity for her to learn and grow," her grandfather continued, his voice firm, "and I'm sure she will make us all proud." But Betty didn't look proud. She looked terrified. The room erupted into applause, but Betty remained frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief. I watched as the reality of the situation settled over her. She hadn't been given a promotion. She had been sent away, to a place where she would no longer have access to the luxury and comfort she had always known. Her grandfather's decision was clear. This was a punishment, a way to teach her a lesson. Betty tried to catch her grandfather's eye, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. Instead, he was smiling, shaking hands with colleagues, clearly pleased with the outcome. Betty's life was about to change in ways she had never expected, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. As the night went on, Betty kept to herself, a far cry from the woman who had once dominated every room she entered. John, meanwhile, seemed to sense that something had shifted between them. He leaned in close to me, his voice low. "Mom," he said, "I think things with Betty, I don't know how much longer they're going to last." I nodded, understanding all too well. The cracks in their marriage had finally started to show, and this time I wasn't sure they could be fixed.